In this demo, we're going to learn how to use a new tool we haven't looked at yet called Puppet Warp. And we're going to use that to make an animation of this guy's head changing is the best way to describe what we're going to do to it. So what I need you to do is I need you to go to your browser and just do an image search for head on white background. You can choose any head on any white background you want. There are some pretty great ones. I chose this one in particular because the resolution is really high, so it's going to have a high quality output. Some of these other ones aren't so good. This guy's might be pretty great. You could even do this giraffe head if you want. It really doesn't matter. This guy, creepy dude with his espresso, you could do that as well. Okay, so when you choose an image, a lot of people will just grab this preview image and then you don't get the full resolution image. You actually need to go to View Image and then right click on it. And in Chrome, I can just go to Copy Image and then go to Photoshop. And if I hit Command or Control N to create a new file, it'll automatically take whatever's in my clipboard. So since I copied the image from Chrome, now I'm making a new file that size, and then all I have to do is paste it. So I paste the image in here. Now you'll see I have layer 1 and I just have a blank white background. We're going to leave that as it is right now, but with layer 1 what we need to do is we need to select this white background, and the reason I'm having you do this with an image on the white background is it just makes this step much faster. So I'm going to use the quick selection tool, and I'm just going to click and drag in the white area to select that, and then I can hit delete. Now I'm not going to see any difference right away, and that's because I have this white background layer on here, which I'm going to go ahead and leave on for the time being. I do want to deselect this area, so I can either hit Command or Control D to get rid of that. And now I've got this head, and let's go ahead, let's turn the background off. So I've got this head floating on a transparent backdrop. And now what I need to do is I could just go in and use Puppet Warp right now, but much like with using filters or anything else, Puppet Warp, once I change this, I'm not going to be able to ever get it back to its default state. And so what I need to do is I need to turn this into a smart object. Now this will do two things. One, it's going to allow us to revert this back to its normal state. And two, we can actually edit the Puppet Warp that we've made. So we can duplicate this layer, make some tweaks, duplicate the layer, make a few more tweaks, and then we can use this to animate pretty quickly. So I'm going to right click on this layer. I'm going to go down to Convert to Smart Object. And now that I've made it a smart object, it's time to use the Puppet Warp. So we're going to go up to Edit. We're going to go down to Puppet Warp. And when I click on this, I get this weird mesh over the top of my image. And notice that it's conforming to the edges where there is no transparency. If I still had that white background, this mesh would be spread out over the entire image. So there's a few things I can do, a few settings I can make, but before we do that, I just want to show you how this tool works, and then we'll experiment with that. So if I drop one pin, right, that's what my cursor looks like right now. If I just drop one pin right on his nose and then click and drag, this works just like, and you can see if I actually stretch it, I'm sort of scaling him a little bit, and you can see how the mesh is working, but essentially I can rotate his whole head around this one pin, right? Much like if you were to pin a rubber sheet to a wall and then grab it by one point, you could rotate it around that pin and you could stretch it. And that's exactly how Puppet Warp works. I can take my pins, right? I can click on whichever one I want to select, and then I can move this around. Now, before I do that, I'm going to undo that motion. And once I have a pin selected, I can also hit delete to get rid of it if I've put it somewhere I don't actually want it. Right? So let's say I want to make this man's head swell to an enormous size, and that's the animation I'm going to do. To do that, I do want to pin a couple places so that his shoulders essentially stay in place, right? So I'm going to come as close to the edge as I can and get a pin to drop. And you'll notice sometimes when you click that doesn't happen, so you have to move in just a little bit. I'm just going to make sure I get all 4 corners of his shirt adjusted. And I might drop a couple pins right by the edges of his neck as well. And maybe even one down by his tie. And that's going to make sure that if I make any changes up here, there's going to be a minimal effect on the bottom. Now you'll see that it's actually pulling up from the bottom edge a little bit as I lift his nose up in a disturbing way. Maybe this is what the animation should be. It just be bonk, 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 bonk. All right, so maybe we'll try that. But so I'm going to undo this step. So I will probably drop a couple more pins down here to try and hold this all in place while I move his head. So to make a simple animation, I've created my puppet warp. I've got my mesh here. Now, this is my original image, and so I don't want to modify this one yet. I just want to have the pins set in place. So I'm going to hit the check mark at the top of the screen or the enter or return key on the keyboard. And that will allow, this will create a smart filter, and I have this puppet warp listed here. Now if I double click on puppet warp, that's going to allow me to edit the puppet warp that I have attached to this layer. And again, I have to either say no or just check mark to say, yeah, I'm okay with those changes, which I didn't make any. So now that I've got this, I need to duplicate this layer. And there's the quickest way to do that is you can either right click, hit duplicate, and hit OK to duplicate it. That's one way of doing it. The other option is just to click and drag on the layer and drag it to the new layer icon down here. And that will duplicate a layer and you don't have to go through the dialog box. It's much faster. And then what you can do is, since we have 2 layers now, I could actually select both of these layers, pull these down, go down to that new layer icon, and now I've duplicated 2 layers at once. So now I have essentially 4 images that I can use as frames in my animation. Okay, so I've duplicated the layer. So now on this duplicate layer, I'm going to double click on Puppet Warp. And now I'm going to start moving this guy's head around. So I'm going to make this maybe a 9 frame animation. So frame 1 is just going to be him by in his normal self. Frame 2, his head's going to be coming up maybe over here just a little bit. Check mark. And then I'm going to go ahead and I can duplicate this frame. Or this layer, excuse me. And once I've duplicated that layer, I can double click here. I can stretch this out just a little bit more. And you'll see what's nice is I can see the other layers underneath this, so I know where his head is going. I can hit enter on the keyboard to set that and duplicate this layer. And with this one, double click again. Okay, so I've got this layer set. So now I'm going to need to go ahead and set this. And you can see the mesh is starting to warp his face. Now you could experiment with this. We could actually make his head larger. We could do all sorts of stuff. But I'm actually just going to stretch his head and have it bounce back and forth. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this frame. And double click again. And this time his head's going to start coming back down. I kind of want it to go down a little faster than it did before. I don't want it to be perfectly the same as it was. So I'm going to hit enter to set that one. Duplicate this frame. Double click on Puppet Warp. Grab this pin again. Pull it down a little bit lower. Enter. Duplicate. It's going to be a little longer than I initially said, but that's fine. And I really want his head to kind of squish down a little bit, like lower than it should be, because we want this to be springy. And we're going to come back up here, duplicate this, stretch his head back this way, hit enter, duplicate this layer, double click, Make his head stretch up a little bit higher. Hit enter. And duplicate this layer one more time. Double click. And then stretch his head way up here. And hit enter. Okay, now his nose is starting to go crazy. And that's because the way the mesh works is it's starting to fold over on itself a little bit, like it's getting too close there. So I'd probably want to put a second pin in there and pull his nose out a bit. But because I'm trying to go fast, we're not going to do that. So now we need to create a frame animation. If you don't have your timeline window open at the bottom, just go to Window, Timeline, check mark that. And we're going to do a frame animation, not a video timeline. So we're going to create a frame animation. And then we want to click on the panel menu here and go down to Make Frames from Layers. Now, when we do this, you'll see our first layer is going to be totally blank, right? That's because it's the background layer, which if you remember is just a white background. So I'm just going to delete this first frame. We might want that background in there eventually. And now I'm going to go ahead and change the looping to forever. And I'm going to hit play, and I'm just going to see what this little animation looks like, right? He looks so happy with his little bouncy head. All right, so, and something I didn't talk about the first time we talked about frame animation mode is this 0 seconds here underneath each of these frames. 0 seconds means that the delay between each of these frames is essentially set to go as fast as the computer can render each frame coming at it. Now, when we're in Photoshop and we're dealing with smart objects and all of these other things, Photoshop is working really hard to draw these frames, and so it's animating more slowly. What we want to do generally, because computers run at different speeds, is we want to say this is the frame rate, this is the number of seconds or thousands of seconds that I want to have take place before I should draw another frame on the screen. And so if you select all of your frames and then click on the little white arrow under any one of the frames, it doesn't matter which one, you can say no delay, which is the default, 0.1 seconds, 0.2 seconds, 0.5 seconds. You can make 10-second delay between frames, which would be a little bit crazy. Even 0.1 seconds is pretty good. That means that it's 10 frames per second, right? And that's a pretty slow animation. If we wanted to do, say, 20 frames per second, let's go ahead and do that, right? We can't, it's not a default, but if we wanted 20 frames per second, we would go to Other, and we would change this to 0.05, right? And hit OK. And now if we play this, right, we might not notice the difference in Photoshop, but if we take these, if we were to export this as a GIF animation, we'd be able to tell the difference when we put it in the browser, right? So here he is happily bouncing his head back and forth. All right, maybe we should put a rainbow gradient in the background because he's so happy, he's like walking on sunshine or something. So let's go ahead and add the background into every one of these layers. To do that, we're going to select each and every layer, and then we're going to turn the visibility of the background on. And once we've turned the visibility of the background on, let's select the background layer, and let's create a gradient, and let's find a nice, beautiful rainbow, and make a nice rainbow gradient behind him. And there he goes. He's the happiest corporate person I've ever seen in my entire life. Okay, so now we can export this as a GIF. So remember, we have to go down to File, Export, Save for Web. And now, something to note, this is an absolutely huge image file, right? Our resolution is 1500 pixels by 2000 pixels. That's more than we would ever need, and it may crash the program if you try to export that. So what we need to do is reduce the image size, right? So I want this to be maybe I want it to be 400 pixels tall, right? So it's going to be 400 by 300 pixels roughly. And it's already linked, so we know it's going to be scaled uniformly when we do this. Looping options, the quality we could change. I'm just going to say by cubic, and I'm going to save this. When I do that, let me zoom out a little bit here. When I do that, I'm just going to call this Corp Bop. I don't know. Whatever you want to call it. I'm going to save it. And then I'm going to go ahead and go to Chrome. I'm going to go down to File, Open File, Photoshop Demos, Corp Bop. Oh my goodness. Right? And there it is. Now, I clearly could have added a few more frames. That's going a little bit fast. But I hope you can experiment with this. I wanted to do a quick demo. Puppet Warp is really great. You can use it to do a lot more useful things than making a guy's head bop back and forth on a rainbow background. There is another demo out there that shows how to animate a hawk flapping its wings. Obviously, they're not going to fold all the way in against its body, but you can give that a little motion. There's tons of different things you can do with Puppet Warp, but this just introduces you to the tool. Now, I want to show you a couple more features on the tool before we end this demo. And that's just to give you an idea what these other options do. So, okay, so go to the last frame of your animation and go to the final frame or final layer as well, the top layer. Double click on Puppet Warp. Now, there's a few settings up here we haven't talked about. First, the mode being normal. There's 3 different settings, and you'll notice with our one pin, that it even makes a big difference. I'm sorry, I didn't expect his head to get quite that big. But distort is clearly the most, it clearly modifies things the most. Rigid modifies things much less, and normal does it somewhere in between, right? So we haven't done this yet, but I can drop a couple more points here and I can actually pull his cheeks out. Now if I change this to distort, right, it's going to be a lot different. I'm going to really be scaling his head up. You can see how these changes are much more exaggerated with distort. The other thing we can do, I'm going to go back to normal. The other thing we can do is we can go from density to either have more or fewer points. And I'm going to go to more points. Now, when you start working with meshes this dense, your computer's going to start complaining very frequently. But there's times when you're trying to work on something, like let's go ahead and say normal points. And let's say I really want to pull his nostril out. Now, when I click here, it says I can't add a new pin because it's too close to an existing. Right? So this is the time when you want to get in here and get a detail, you need a little bit more room to work. That's when you want to add more points, because then I can come in here and I can click here, right? And I have these 2 points really close together. Or if I wanted to make his eye really long, I might need to be able to have these 3 points very, very close together, right? I'm doing horrible things to this man's face. I'm going to check mark that. Oh yeah, that's looking great. Okay, so let me get back into Puppet Warp real quick. So the other thing you can do is the expansion is 2 pixels, right? What that does is it really just says where's the outside of this mesh. Do I want the mesh to line up pretty much with the edge of the object that I've selected, with the layer I've selected, or do I want it to expand beyond that? In this case, 2 pixels outside is totally fine. You can also choose to show the mesh or not show the mesh. The best way to show you what pin depth does is to show you another example. So I'm going to undo all of those horrible things I did to this guy's face in this last one. And I'm just going to go ahead and open a new file. I'm going to leave it set to whatever these settings are. And then I'm not going to animate this. I'm going to create a new layer. and I'm going to create a selection area that's kind of long and narrow, just a rectangular selection area. I'm going to use my gradient tool. I'm going to do a rainbow gradient. Just going to pull this down in this selection area, and then I'm going to deselect my selection area. I'm going to grab this. Now I have this rainbow box. I can move wherever I want it to, wherever I want to. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use Puppet Warp again. So in this case, let's go ahead and make it a smart object, just in case we need to make any changes. And so I'm going to go to Edit, Puppet Warp. And so I've got this dense thing in here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set several points down the length of this strip. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop it over as though it's a piece of fabric, and it's going to loop on top of itself. And I'm going to leave the mode set to normal, density normal, all that's the same. So all I need to do is I need to start bending this guy around. You can see it actually gives me quite a lot of freedom when I'm not doing something with someone's face. Okay. And so I put these all in order, right? And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn off Show Mesh, because this will make this a lot easier to see what's going on. So I've unchecked Show Mesh, and so you'll see the red and orange is going over the other one. So if I select this pin here, and I go up to pin depth and drop this down, it's going to reverse the order that I set the pins, right? So initially, this was the first pin I set, and this was the last pin I set. So by default, the last pin you set is quote unquote on top of the other, even though this is a 2D image, right? This is on top of the other one. So if you have something where you want your mesh to be overlapping the other mesh, you can see what happens here. We get this weird artifacting that's occurring, and that's because this is actually rendering this in OpenGL. It's a 3D modeling thing, and this is actually a thing. So what we want to do is we want to probably send that one backwards as well, right? If I send this one forward, we're going to have issues. If I send it backwards, then everything's okay. So there's one final ability, which is actually to be able to rotate things as though they are puppets, like jointed puppets. And so with this image, which unfortunately being black and white on a white background makes this kind of incredibly challenging to select, I've just grabbed, to make things quick, I've left a whole bunch of white space that I'm going to transfer onto a new layer with this. So I'm going to hit Command Copy, Command V, turn off layer 1, and just turn off the background as well, just so we can see this whole thing. Now, I could come in here, I could clean this up, I could get rid of some of this white here, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to work with this the way it is. And I'm not even going to turn this into a smart object. We're just going to go for it. So I'm going to go to Edit, Puppet Warp, and I'm going to put points. I'm going to drop pins where I want the joints to be. I want these antennae to be able to rotate around. I want his limbs to be able to rotate, his little legs down here to be able to rotate. And then I also want to make sure that his body stays straight. So I'm going to put 3 or 4 pins from the base of his body all the way up the center of his spine, just so that I know that that part of his body isn't going to rotate. Now, I may start making some rotations and notice that this just isn't going to work. But the feature is pretty simple. I'm going to select the point that I want to use by clicking on it once. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt. And when I do this, now I don't want to click on it right away, because that's going to delete this point. I need to pull out until I get this circle. And then I'm going to click and drag, and you'll see that maybe I should have put that pin in a different place, or in fact, maybe what I'll do is I'll drop another pin here. And now I can rotate this, and I'm still getting a little bit of his face, and so what I would probably want to do is drop another pin here. so that I can just, and this is just trial and error, there we go. Now, you know, he's getting a little squishing of his head, but I have this joint, right? I'm able to rotate this antenna around without modifying the rest of his head too much. And so I can check with these other points as well and see if I can rotate them. And clearly I'm going to need to have a couple other points set before I'm able to do that. And so this is a little bit better, right? I could make him do a little waving or something without it getting too crazy. Now if I go too much, it's going to flip over on itself and it's not going to be very useful. Right? And so the same thing's probably going to go for his legs, right? You know, I could get his little legs to wiggle a touch, but not too much. Now with this, you know, you want to make sure if you've got, you know, if I had another point out here and I'm rotating this, it's not going to work very well unless I bring his leg with me, right? So that's another thing you can do is you can actually, you know, pull these around and make these points do their own thing. Right? Rotating this end point isn't going to do me much good. And again, you can always delete a point. You just select it and hit the delete key to get back to where you are. So this is just one last final feature I wanted to show you, is that you can select these things. I'm going to uncheck Show Mesh. You can select these points, hold down Option or Alt, and get here so you can really just rotate these and have these limbs go the way they're going. Now, you can work with this in conjunction, right? Much like I did with the rainbow, you can say, oh, I want this thing to be tucked behind his arm. And if we didn't have all this extra white space, we'd be able to make it look as though these different appendages of his, which again, I'm probably going to need to drop a couple points here and here to get this to go. Right, but these other appendages of his could go behind all of these other points, right? And so depending on what point I select, I can determine what parts of the image should be in front of the which other parts. This gives you a lot of, as an animator, this gives you a ton of control to be able to do this to anyone's body or anything that you've found online or anything that you've created.